Hello, and welcome back to Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup, and as promised, today I have a true crime story for you. This is about a patient who lived at Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital for the remainder of his life following this gory crime. Trigger warnings for this episode include outdated, ableist, and racist language, harm toward children, and descriptions of homicide. If true crime isn't really for you, then I encourage you to come back next week for a more lighthearted episode. My main sources for this episode include case notes from the State v. Noel dated May 17th, 1926, case law on State v. Noel dated October 8th, 1925, and the Wikipedia page on Harrison W. Noel. All other sources will be listed at the end of the episode transcript. So for now, come on in and get comfortable as we go behind the walls of Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital. Harrison W. Noel was born on April 16, 1905, in Manhattan, New York. His family moved to Montclair, New Jersey when Noel was about 5 years old. He had a brother and a sister, and his parents divorced when he was still quite young. His father was said to be intemperate after the marriage ended. Noel's family, especially on his mother's side, had a history of mental health problems. His maternal aunt had been diagnosed with melancholia and later died by suicide. 2 of the 5 grandchildren on the maternal grandparents' side were said to be, quote, abnormal. There weren't any other details provided, but this could refer to mood dysfunction and or developmental disabilities. Noel was said to have no difficulties in school until his junior year of high school. That year, he ended up failing all of his final exams. There's no indication of why this happened, but obviously something must have been going on. Noel ended up studying all summer and retaking and passing the exams he had failed. He completed his senior year without any problems and passed the entrance exam to go to Harvard. So far, there aren't any huge red flags. I mean, I would like to know more about whatever happened during his junior year, but it sounds like this is an intelligent guy who comes from a certain level of financial privilege, at least. And what happens next is nothing short of diagnostic. And I need you to brace yourselves and get ready for what is going to be a year in this man's life. This is a very long excerpt taken from the State v. Noel from the New Jersey Court of Errors and Appeals, dated May 17th, 1926. And I will be interrupting myself at times because this is very long and requires some clarification. For reference, I had to sketch out all of this in a timeline because it's a lot, so buckle up. He made arrangements to go to Harvard and then suddenly conceived the notion that he must go to Andover. He went to Andover and remained there 2 days. He then went to Harvard and remained there until the Christmas vacation, and then he left. He returned home and obtained a position in the stock exchange as a messenger. He retained this 2 weeks. He then said he was going to study Latin and mathematics and nothing else. He remained home between 2 and 3 weeks, during which time he secluded himself in his room except at meals. He did not associate with his brother or other members of the family. He did not go out. He obtained a piece of black cheesecloth and built a coop around his desk and chair in the middle of his room on the 3rd floor and stayed inside the coop for days at a time, apparently studying. He then rented a cottage in an isolated section of Ramapo Valley about 5 miles from the Oakland Railroad Station. He left his home one evening at 9 p.m. when there was a heavy fall of snow to go to this cottage. He would not heed the request of his mother to remain home until morning. He took with him a large number of law books, saying he was not going to study Latin and mathematics anymore. He stayed in this cottage 3 weeks. He cooked his own meals. He then left suddenly, came home, and said that he was going to Middlebury College at Middlebury in the state of Vermont. He went to Middlebury. He did not enter the college. He stayed in a small farmhouse for 2 or 3 weeks. He then went to Williamstown, Massachusetts to enter Williams College. He did not attend Williams, but rented a small farmhouse located in the hills about 7 miles from Williamstown. He then announced that he had discovered that in order to become strong, he should live on ordinary cow bran. He carried a bag of this bran weighing 55 pounds from Williamstown to his cottage, 7 miles distant. He stayed in this cottage for 2 months. He then came home for a week. He went back to Williamstown. He stayed there for a week, and he returned home. Okay, quick pause. There's a lot going on here, and it's not even finished. Like, clearly, this guy cannot stay in one place for very long. He's restless and impulsive, and he's hyper focused on certain subjects. He's isolating himself and engaging in odd behaviors. And basically, in psychology, whenever we say someone is doing or saying something strange, that's usually diagnosed as disorganized behavior or disorganized speech. There isn't an indication of how well he's caring for himself, though, which could also clue us into how he's doing mentally. We know he's able to cook his own meals, at least while he was at the cabin. So right now, there's not a lot to make a full diagnosis, but we have several months of odd behavior and lots of restlessness. So clearly, this young man is very ill. And of course, it escalates in a dangerous way. And the section goes on. His family planned a camping trip. His father, mother, brother, and sisters and himself started out. He slept with his brother in a tent, and when the family had retired, they were awakened by the cries of the defendant's father saying he had been attacked. He had been attacked. Several violent blows had been made on his head with a hatchet. He had thrown up his arms to protect his head, and one arm was cut severely. The hatchet was found in the bed of the defendant with blood upon it. Upon being asked if he had struck his father, he said, "Why, then I must have struck him." He wrapped himself up and went to sleep. He gave no explanation of his conduct. He showed no grief. There had been no friction between his father and himself. He was then examined by a New York specialist and was committed to a sanatorium at Beacon, New York. He was there for 4 months. He never spoke unless spoken to. Frequently, he would not answer when addressed. He refused to leave his room for long periods of time. He insisted upon remaining in his room naked. He could not be induced to cross a place where the sun was shining. He had homicidal manias. He required 2 attendants. His moods changed frequently. He ran away from an attendant and succeeded in getting across the Hudson River to Newburgh, where he was apprehended by a police officer. He left this institution and returned to his father's home. He insisted that the only thing he wanted to eat was round steak and nothing else, which he had 3 times a day. He soon changed from this to Roquefort cheese and ate this 3 times a day. He was then taken for treatment to a Dr. Emerson in Boston. He procured a weighing machine and weighed all the food that he ate. He soon returned home. He insisted that he must have salt pork with every meal. He also said it was impossible for him to go upstairs and insisted upon living downstairs. He obtained a mattress and slept downstairs. He then became possessed of the idea that he must eat rye bread and no other kind. He made trips to various cities for the purpose of finding a certain kind of rye bread. He bought some in a shop in Jersey City. He made frequent trips to Jersey City in order to buy this. It could be obtained in any bakery. He then changed his diet to pumpernickel, which he went to New York City to buy. He slept for 2 weeks in a coal bin. And again, another interruption. So obviously the attack on his father should have been a huge red flag that he was not well. I'm glad that he was taken to a psych hospital, but I'm curious why he was only there for 4 months. Maybe his family said they'd take him back and care for him? Who knows? But we start to see this huge escalation in obsessive compulsive traits, which isn't unusual for someone with schizophrenia. We also see a lot of negative symptoms of schizophrenia during his hospital stay, like the isolation, not speaking, barely moving. All of that is considered negative symptoms. functions that are supposed to be present in people that aren't in schizophrenia. Okay, back to the excerpt. It's still going. Arrangements were made for him to take a trip to the south with his father. He did not appear at the railroad station. His father returned home. He then said he must go alone. He went to Tennessee by train and then walked through the hilly section of Tennessee. He returned home for a week and then went to Jacksonville and there took a Danish steamer for Hamburg, Germany. He telegraphed from Hamburg for money to come home. When he arrived home, he stayed 20 days. He entered Columbia College. He remained between 2 and 3 weeks. He then announced that he was going for a trip through the Alleghenies. After again returning for a short period to his home, he took up a bricklaying course at the New York YMCA. He went to Hartford. He found employment as a bricklayer. He then began to make pom-poms. He installed machinery for this purpose in his room. And side note, I couldn't find out what a pom-pom was other than for crafting or cheerleading. So if you know, help me out. He found employment as a mail carrier. He gave this up and went to New York City to go into the pom-poms business. He was next heard of in Clifton Springs, New York. He was in the custody of the police authorities there. His discharge was obtained. He then returned to Columbia College. His mother was then informed that he was again arrested at Clifton Springs. She went there. She was informed that they thought her son was insane. She agreed to have him committed in New Jersey or New York. He had gone to Clifton Springs to see a scoutmaster who had been at Montclair. He was then examined by physicians and later committed by Judge Brennan of the Juvenile Court of Essex County to the Overbrook Hospital for the Insane. There, he assaulted the night attendant. He was confined to a strong room reserved for violent patients. He would rush at the door to break it down. At one time, 4 guards were required to hold the door. He walked about his room naked. He had delusions that his food was poisoned. He wanted to be called Tessie, saying that he was a female. He would take his clothes off before other patients. He proposed marriage to his attendant. He refused to wear shoes. He became violent, tearing at the sheets and pulling down the curtains of his room. He would not eat for 2 or 3 days at a time. Other times he would eat ravenously, disregarding table utensils and using his hands. His habits were abnormal. He was in the institution from February 25th, 1925 to June 28th, 1925, when he escaped. He went to his home. His mother promised to return him to the Overbrook authorities. He then took his sister's bicycle and rode to New York City. He was taken by a police officer in New York City to Bellevue Hospital. At Bellevue, he was examined by a physician who pronounced him insane and suffering from a form of insanity known as dementia praecox. His father took him from Bellevue Hospital against the physician's advice. He was in New York for a while and then returned to Montclair. Then the occurrences of September 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th, heretofore related, took place. The fact that he was taken from the hospital against medical advice is tragic. I mean, clearly this man, and he's only 20 years old at this point, was very, very ill. He'd already proven himself to be dangerous to his stepfather, and now his biological father is swearing he'll take care of him. And I have to ask, how did he think he was going to be able to take care of his son when he could barely even be contained in a strong room by 4 men? The well-meaning is there, but this is someone who is dangerous and quickly escalating. And unfortunately, this decision would have deadly consequences. While Noel was still in New York City on August 24th, 1925, he purchased a pistol at a sporting goods store. He had it shipped to him and it arrived in New Jersey the next day on August 25th. This would become important during the later investigation. Noel then began scheming, and clearly, he had been thinking about what he wanted to do for a long time. And on the morning of Thursday, September 3rd, 1925, he took action. You see, Noel had been planning for some time to kidnap a girl who lived at 136 Upper Mountain Avenue. So he hopped in his maroon overland car, headed over to the address, and snatched 6-year-old Mary Daly. The thing was, Mary Daly didn't live at 136 Upper Mountain Avenue. The Bauer family did. So right around noon, John Sandin, who was a chauffeur for the Bauers, was washing the family's Buick sedan when he heard a commotion. A Dodge taxi was quickly moving away, and someone must have yelled out to Sandin to follow that car because he immediately hopped in the Buick and began pursuing the Dodge. He followed the Dodge for 8 or 9 miles before he was able to pull up alongside the taxi. He saw a man in the driver's seat with a young girl next to him. The man then stopped his car, leaned over to grab something, and retrieved a pistol. He then turned and shot Sandin in the head and drove away. Sandin, however, would recover from his injury, but he wasn't able to remember anything following the shooting. And this is where the official record gets messy, and I can't quite follow the timeline. You may remember that I said that Noel jumped in his maroon overland car, but he was observed in front of 136 Upper Mountain Avenue in the Dodge taxi. See, before Noel kidnapped Mary Daly, he knew he needed a different car. Whether it was a crime of opportunity or planned isn't clear, but he ended up finding Raymond Pierce, a black man who drove a Dodge taxicab. Pierce was last observed at the railroad station in the town of Montclair, New Jersey, on Thursday, September 3rd, the same day as the kidnapping, around 1:30 p.m. But again, this is where the timeline doesn't match up. Someone claims to have seen Pierce at 1:30 p.m., but Noel had already taken his vehicle by noon. It's possible that one of the witnesses was incorrect, but it does make the timeline a little messy. In any case, Noel would later say that he shot and killed Pierce in order to obtain his taxi. He used the stolen taxi to kidnap Mary Daly, caused the commotion that made John Sandin chase him for miles before stopping and shooting him. Noel drove Mary Daly out to the woods before also shooting her in the head and dumping her body. He then abandoned the taxi in the woods near Bradford Avenue and reclaimed his maroon overland car and returned home. After he got home, he put on clean clothes, went to the library to check out some books, and went to a phone booth where he looked up the number of the people who lived at 136 Upper Mountain Avenue. He found the name Mr. J.A. Bauer and dialed. A woman answered. Noel asked the woman if she had any interest in the little girl that had been taken away that morning, and when she said yes, he demanded a ransom of $4,000 for her return. $4,000, by the way, in today's money is about $72,000. He told her there would be some banks open in the theater district in Upper New York City. He detailed a plan about how he would be waiting at a certain point along the train track. And after the family had obtained the money, they were to take the 8:22 train and wait until they saw a red balloon. When they saw the red balloon, they were to throw the $4,000 out at that point, after which the girl would be returned. Of course, we know that at this point, Mary Daly was already dead, and the number he dialed wasn't even her family. What gets me about this story is how lackadaisical he is about it all. He just goes home and cleans up, stops by to pick up some library books, and makes the phone call like nothing is wrong. The next day, Noel leaves his car abandoned near a quarry that was close to the woods where Mary's body and the taxi had been abandoned, and then he presumably took the train into New York City. While he was in the city, his maroon overland car was spotted by the wife of the police chief. She thought it seemed suspicious, so she called it in to a detective along with the license plate number. The detective, Fred Gallagher, called the license bureau in Trenton and learned that the car belonged to the Noel family. The next day, on Saturday, September 5th, around 11:20 a.m., the taxicab was found in the woods near the quarry. Now, certainly, someone must have noticed that the driver of the taxicab was nowhere to be seen. If he had had family, perhaps someone was out looking for him? Around 5 p.m. on Saturday, Herbert H. Matz was walking along Little Falls Road at Cedar Grove. When he arrived at the bridge over the Peckham River, he looked through the brush at the side of the road. His eye was attracted to something white. He made an investigation. He found the dead body of a man, afterwards identified as Raymond Pierce. The white article which he had seen from the road was a shirt upon the body of Pierce. Pierce had been killed by a .32 caliber steel-jacketed bullet. The bullet had entered the lower back part of Pierce's head. The pistol from which it had been discharged had been held so close to the head of Pierce that the scalp showed a slight burn. So, side note, I guess, that means he was killed execution style, just very brutal and callous. A physician at 11 p.m. on the same day performed an autopsy. He was of the opinion that Pierce had been dead longer than 14 hours and less than 48 hours, and probably in the neighborhood of 24 hours. But remember that this is Saturday evening already by the time that Pierce's body was found, and he was likely killed in the late morning or early afternoon on Thursday. So the coroner's estimate is a little off, but again, it is 1925. At the same time that Pierce's body was found, Detective Gallagher showed up at the Noel's house to speak to Harrison. He was asked where his maroon overland car was on Friday, the previous day. Noel insisted that he had driven the car to Morristown, New Jersey that day, which was quite different from his previous story about going to New York City. Gallagher took Noel back to the police headquarters and interrogated him until 5 a.m. the next day. It wasn't until 3 or 4 a.m. that Noel admitted he took the child, and around 5 a.m. he said he would show them where she was. He went in an automobile with several officers and directed that the car be driven from Montclair up through Little Falls, and then up a back road to a point where he directed the driver to stop. They all got out, and Noel said, "There she is." The body of Mary Daly was discovered. She had been shot in the side of the head. The defendant was then brought back to police headquarters. He was then asked what he had done with Pierce. He said he had shot Pierce. He then went in an automobile with members of the police force and directed them to the place on Bradford Avenue where he had shot Pierce. He was then asked what had become of the gun, and he said he was under the rear seat of his car. The overland car was searched in the Noel garage, and the pistol was found in the place Noel had designated. Upon his return to the Montclair police headquarters from the second automobile trip, Noel was told by Captain Mason that he desired him to make a statement of everything he had done. Noel was then warned that such a statement would be used against him, and he replied that it was all right. In answer to questions asked him by a detective, Thomas Diamond, a statement was prepared which was handed to the defendant. He read it and signed it about 7:30 p.m. on Sunday, September 6th. And of course, there was the other evidence that was found as well. On Sunday, September 6th, Gallagher searched the room of Noel. He found upon the floor beggar lice, a variety of weed which grew in the woods near Bradford Avenue in Cedar Grove. A box of .32 caliber steel-jacketed bullets and a receipt for a .32 caliber Spanish automatic pistol were also found in the room of Noel. The receipt showed that the pistol had been purchased on August 24, 1925, at a sporting goods store in New York City. The receipt was made to Wallace Payne, Falls Road, Little Falls, New Jersey. The manager of the store where the pistol had been bought testified at the trial that the pistol had been bought and mailed to Wallace Payne at the address mentioned. The postmaster at Little Falls identified Noel as the one who received a package 8 inches long and 5 or 6 inches wide on August 25, 1925. A Spanish automatic pistol was found under the back seat of the maroon overland touring car. Stains were observed by Captain Mason of the Essex County Prosecutor's Office on the coat of Noel and on the leather cushion of the front seat of the Dodge taxicab of Pierce. Examination of these stains showed that they were the spots of the blood of mammals. Now, in a strange twist to this story, Noel would later say that his crime spree had been inspired, if you will, by another infamous crime, that of Leopold and Loeb, which had taken place the previous year in May 1924. So, not to derail this story too much, but that murder had been called the crime of the century. In it, two college students, Nathan Leopold Jr. and Richard Loeb, kidnapped and murdered 14-year-old Bobby Franks in Chicago, Illinois, in an attempt to carry out the, quote, perfect crime and show their superior intellect. So this, apparently, was what Noel hoped to recreate. Noel was then tried for the crimes, found guilty, and sentenced to death. But he had been evaluated by multiple forensic examiners to determine if insanity played a role in his defense. They all testified that Noel was suffering from a form of dementia praecox called catatonia dementia praecox. So this is essentially what we would call the negative symptoms of schizophrenia today. And their opinion was that Noel was incapable of rationally comprehending the condition in which he was and of aiding his counsel in the conduct of his defense. This is what we would call incompetent to stand trial today, although it sounds like they were doing it after the trial. Anyway, the bottom line is that every examiner determined that he was, in fact, insane at the time of the offense and therefore should not be condemned to death, but instead sent to a mental institution. The problem was that Noel had made a deal with investigators when he took them to find Mary Daly's body that he would not go back to Overbrook Hospital for the insane. Mr. Daly, the father of Mary Daly, told Noel that if he would tell him where his girl was, he wouldn't prosecute him at all. The case notes say, quote, "It was natural that a parent, suffering as Mr. Daly was, should offer such an inducement to the defendant. The offer of Mr. Daly was apparently acquiesced in by the experienced officers and detectives present at the time," end quote. But the courts held to their promise and did not send Noel to Overbrook Hospital for the insane. Instead, they sent him to Greystone Park. I couldn't find any information about how he behaved during his hospitalization, but he remained there 52 years until his death in 1977. He was 72 years old. And that's the story of Harrison W. Noel, the kidnapping and murder of Mary Daly, the murder of Raymond Pierce, and the attempted murder of John Sandin. It's a pretty sad and gruesome story, especially since it could have been probably avoided if he had just remained in the hospital. If I were to speculate clinically, as I like to do, about Noel by today's standards, it's possible that he would meet criteria for schizoaffective disorder bipolar type. He certainly seems to have some symptoms of psychosis, including delusions and negative symptoms, but he also seems to have periods of mania. Obviously, I can't officially diagnose someone I've never worked with and don't have complete records for, but this seems to be a reasonable guesstimate at least. As always, thank you so much for listening. Please come back next week for a very special episode where I will be joined by two people who worked to try and save Greystone Park from demolition. You definitely will not want to miss that. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you're listening, but especially if that's on Apple Podcasts. That's a good way to help other people find and listen to the show. Follow the show on Instagram at Behind the Walls Pod and on the Facebook group at Behind the Walls Podcast. You can support the show on Patreon and Beacons, and I'm continuing to add new content to the Patreon page. And of course, remember the words of Maya Angelou. Do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. Until next time. Thank you so much for listening to Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Once again, I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup. Cover image is by Christopher Payne. Check out my website at behindthewallspodcast.buzzsprout.com. Follow the podcast and learn more on Facebook at Behind the Walls Podcast and Instagram at Behind the Walls Pod. For questions or recommendations, email me at behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com. You can find new episodes every Monday on Amazon Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you're listening right now. If you like the show, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. It helps other people find and listen to the show, and I would be so grateful. Please stay tuned for more episodes of Behind the Walls of the World's Psychiatric Hospitals. Until next time.